picture the absolute biggest pop star on the planet right now.
Oh, like someone's selling out massive stadiums, dictating global culture.
Exactly. When you think of that level of fame, you're naturally picturing endless screaming crowds, blinding lights, and a life lived entirely on a very public stage.
Right, because that's basically the mandatory trajectory for superstardom. You build your fame by making sure as many human beings see you perform as physically possible.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive is such a stunning contradiction.
Yeah.
We are looking at a man who completely rewrote the rules of music, yet gave barely 30 public concerts in his entire life.
30? I mean, think about that, just 30.
Right. Imagine that modern stadium-level pop star refusing to ever go on tour, choosing instead to only play their music in the living rooms of their friends. That is the level of fame and the level of reclusiveness we are dealing with today.
And the contrasts, they really just don't stop there. Because this was someone who was physically so fragile that he weighed under 99 pounds at the end of his life. Yeah, but his music was so politically explosive, so dangerous to the ruling powers, that a contemporary famously described his compositions as cannons buried in flowers.
If that isn't enough of a hook to get you invested, we are also talking about a man whose heart was literally cut out of his body after his death.
Sealed in a jar of alcohol.
Yes, and smuggled across European borders in secret. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to explore the life of Frederic Chopin. We're using a comprehensive biographical source to peel back the drawing room stereotypes you might have heard.
Like that whole image of the sickly, delicate, romantic poet at the piano.
Exactly. We want to reveal the human being, the exile, and the fierce genius underneath. But let's start with the obvious puzzle piece, which is how does someone achieve absolute, undeniable cultural saturation without the tour bus?
Well, to understand that, you have to look at the sheer, overwhelming force of his early talent. He didn't need to shout to be heard because from a very early age, his abilities essentially spoke for themselves.
He was a child prodigy, right?
Oh, absolutely. He was born in 1810 in the Duchy of Warsaw, which was a Polish state established by Napoleon. His father was French, his mother was Polish, and he was one of those rare kids who just seemed to arrive fully formed.
How fully formed are we talking?
By the time he was 7 years old, he was already composing polonaises.
Wait, let me make sure I'm picturing this correctly. Most 7-year-olds are, figuring out basic arithmetic, and he is composing intricate national dances.
Precisely. And it escalates so quickly from there. By age 15, he's performing for the Russian Tsar, Alexander I.
No way.
Yeah, and the Tsar is so blown away by this teenager that he literally hands him a diamond ring. But the pivotal element of his musical DNA doesn't actually come from playing for royalty.
Where does it come from then?
Between 1824 and 1828, he spends his summer vacations in a rural area called Safarnia, and that is where he first really encounters Polish rural folk music.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it deeply influences his famous mazurkas. He hears these local musicians, and he starts embedding things like modal scales and drone basses into his classical training.
Okay, let's unpack this terminology for a second, just so we're all on the same page. If I'm listening to a Chopin piece, what exactly does a drone bass or a modal scale sound like to my ear?
Great question. So imagine holding down one low, continuous note on a piano. There's a deep, vibrating hum in the background. It mimics the sound of a rustic bagpipe.
Oh, okay, I can hear that in my head.
Right, that's a drone bass.
Right.
And modal scales, well, instead of the standard, predictable do, re, mi, major, or minor scales you hear in Western classical or pop music, these are older, slightly off-kilter arrangements of notes.
So they don't sound quite as neat and tidy.
Exactly. They sound distinctly earthy. They don't resolve the way your ear expects them to. And he took those raw, rustic sounds and folded them into highly technical piano music.
I do want to challenge this rural folk myth just a bit, though, because in the sources we're looking at, musicologist Barbara Milewski points out something really interesting.
Oh, about the Warsaw connection.
Yeah. We always hear this hyper-romanticized story of classical composers wandering into the fields and having epiphanies while listening to peasants sing. But Milewski argues that Chopin's inspiration came much more from the urbanized, watered-down versions of folk music floating around Warsaw.
Right.
So is there a chance his folk inspiration was basically just a city kid's filtered version of the countryside?
Milewski's argument is actually crucial for understanding his genius. Because, yes, Chopin was absolutely an urban kid. His father taught at the Warsaw Lyceum. They lived on palace grounds.
So he wasn't exactly roughing it in the dirt.
No, not at all. When he wrote a Mazurka, he wasn't acting as an ethnomusicologist transcribing exact field recordings of peasants.
Hmm.
He was taking the idea of the folk dance, that earthy rhythm, and elevating it into high art.
Like a stylized translation.
Exactly. And that agency is what made him brilliant. He invented a new musical language that felt fundamentally Polish, but was designed specifically for the sophisticated concert hall.
But that culturally rich, idyllic Polish youth gets shattered completely. And this feels like the moment where the biography pivots from a prodigy story into a tragedy of exile.
It really does. And right before his world gets upended, we get this incredible, vivid window into his intense emotional life.
You're talking about the letters.
Yes. When he was still in Warsaw, he wrote these deeply passionate letters to a male friend named Titus Wojciechowski. The language he uses is just, it's blazing with feeling.
I actually have one of the quotes right here from the source, and I want to read it because it really stopped me in my tracks.
Go for it.
He writes, "If I were smeared with the oils of Byzantium, you would not kiss me unless I forced you to it by magnetism. There's some kind of power in nature. Today you will dream of kissing me."
Yeah.
That is intense.
Extremely intense. And naturally, modern scholars have debated for years exactly what to make of these letters.
I mean, you can read that a few different ways.
Right. Some historians argue that this was simply the currency of 19th century Romantic-era male friendship, that extreme, dramatic expressions of affection were totally normal.
And the other side of the debate.
Other scholars look at that language and argue it's clear evidence of homosexual impulses.
And obviously, our mission isn't to solve a centuries-old historical debate about his private life, but it paints a picture of someone who felt everything at an absolute 10 out of 10.
Exactly. He was highly emotional.
Which makes what happens next even more devastating.
Right. So at age 20, he leaves Warsaw to further his career, intending to head to Italy via Vienna. But barely a month after he leaves, the November 1830 uprising breaks out.
This is the rebellion against the Russian Empire.
Yes. The Polish people rebel against Russian rule. His friend Titus actually goes back to fight on the barricades.
And Chopin.
Chopin is stranded in Vienna. He's isolated. He's agonizing over what's happening until he finally gets the news that the Russian military has brutally crushed the uprising.
He writes about this in his private journal, and the despair is palpable. He writes, "Oh God, you are there, and yet you do not take vengeance."
You can just feel the sheer helplessness.
Yeah. He can't safely return home. He ends up heading toward France, and his passport gets stamped in transit to London via Paris.
And he would joke for the rest of his life that he was in Paris only in passing.
But the reality was he never set foot in Poland ever again.
What is truly fascinating here is how this forced permanent exile acts as a pressure cooker for his art.
How so?
Well, he's thousands of miles from home, watching his country essentially be erased from the map politically. He couldn't fight the Russians with a sword, so he fought them with the piano.
Okay, but how does that actually work in practice, though? Like, how do you weaponize sheet music?
You do it by turning nostalgia into defiance. Take the Polonaise, for example. Historically, it was a polite, stately dance for the Polish aristocracy.
Very.
Very proper. But Chopin takes that recognizable, comforting national rhythm and he injects it with thunderous, booming chords and aggressive dissonance. He forces the listener to hear the trauma and the pride of Poland.
Ah, so that's where the composer Robert Schumann's famous quote comes from?
Exactly. The idea of his music being cannons buried in flowers. It looked like pretty salon music on the page, but underneath it was fiercely nationalistic rebellion.
That is brilliant. It's like a permanent layover where he accidentally becomes the voice and soul of a nation he can never return to. So he's trapped in this Parisian layover starting in 1831. But again, he doesn't do the normal thing.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't go on a massive European tour to capitalize on this wave of emotion.
Right. He arrives in Paris, and the hype is immediate. I mean, Schumann famously reviews his work by writing, "Hats off, gentlemen, a genius."
So the doors are wide open for him to be the biggest touring act in the world.
Wide open. But Chopin realizes almost instantly that he absolutely despises playing in large concert halls.
Why did he refuse those big rooms, though? Was it stage fright, or did he just view the general public as beneath him?
It wasn't arrogance at all. It was a pure understanding of acoustic physics.
The physics.
Yeah, Chopin's playing technique was entirely unique. He used a lot of rubato, which is the expressive pushing and pulling of tempo, speeding up slightly, then slowing down.
Right.
He also used incredibly delicate nuances, creating a sound that people described as the marriage of crystal and water.
That's beautiful.
It is. But if you take that delicate, highly detailed playing and put it inside a cavernous, 19th century concert hall.
Which basically had the acoustics of a stone barn.
Exactly. All that detail gets lost in the echo. It just turns into muddy noise.
Huh.
He fundamentally understood that his music required physical intimacy to be fully realized.
So he completely pivots. He realizes he can conquer the city's elite from the inside out. He becomes financially independent by publishing his music and teaching wealthy students.
And this isn't just pocket change to scrape by.
No, later on in London, he was charging his students a massive 1 guinea an hour, which was an astronomical sum back then.
It freed him from the grind of public concert.
Exactly, allowing him to just play in the private, dimly lit aristocratic salons of Paris. And this contrast really comes into focus when you look at his relationship with the other major musical figure of the time, Franz Liszt.
Oh, the contrast between Chopin and Liszt is the stuff of legend.
Yeah.
They lived just blocks apart in Paris, but they were complete opposites.
How so?
Well, Liszt was the ultimate showman. He played those massive halls. He was bombastic, theatrical. He played with so much power he would literally snap the strings of pianos.
Seriously?
Oh, yeah. Women swooned over him in a literal frenzy that doctors called Listomania.
Wow.
Meanwhile, Chopin's playing quietly in a drawing room for 30 people.
The sources mention a real love-hate dynamic between them. Chopin definitely envied Liszt's sheer physical stamina and his ability to command a crowd, but he loathed the theatricality.
He hated the showboating.
Yeah. My favorite anecdote from the source is when Liszt performed one of Chopin's nocturnes at a gathering. Now, Liszt, being Liszt, decided to add his own flashy, intricate embellishments to the music.
That's right.
Chopin was absolutely furious. He marched up to Liszt and basically told him, "You play the music exactly as I wrote it, or you don't play it at all."
That confrontation perfectly encapsulates their completely different philosophies of what art is.
Right?
For Liszt, a piece of sheet music was a starting point, just a loose suggestion for a live performance. But for Chopin, a score was a precise, painstakingly crafted piece of architecture. You don't just add a massive, tacky gargoyle to someone else's building because you feel like it in the moment.
I love that analogy. But while his professional life in Paris was this highly controlled, meticulously curated ecosystem of elite salons, his personal life was about to become incredibly chaotic.
Very chaotic.
Because in 1836, he meets a woman who flips his entire world upside down.
Enter George Sand.
Yeah.
Born Aurore Dupin, she was a wildly successful French author who used a male pen name, and she was fiercely unconventional, especially for the 1830s.
She broke all the rules.
She really did. She was short, she openly smoked cigars, and she frequently wore men's clothing just so she could access places in Paris where women were legally banned from entering.
And Chopin, this fastidious, elegant man, his initial reaction is basically disgust. He famously asks a friend, "What an unattractive person Lisand is. Is she really a woman?"
It's the worst possible first impression.
Truly.
But despite that initial repulsion, they are drawn to each other's intellect and intensity. They become lovers.
Yeah.
And in 1838, they decide they need to get out of Paris.
They need a vacation.
Right? Sand wants to escape a former lover and the toxic city gossip, and they both hope that a sunny Mediterranean climate will help improve Chopin's lingering respiratory illnesses.
It makes sense.
So they pack up and head to the Spanish island of Majorca.
If anyone listening has ever gone on what they thought would be a relaxing romantic getaway, only for absolutely everything to go wrong, this is the ultimate 19th century version of that.
Oh, it's so much worse than a bad hotel.
They go expecting a paradise and they walk into a waking nightmare.
It is a disaster from the moment they arrive. The locals in Majorca are deeply Catholic, and because Sand and Chopin aren't married and don't attend Mass, the locals become incredibly hostile.
They practically shun them.
Yeah, no one will even rent them a proper house.
Mm-hmm.
Out of desperation, they are forced to seek shelter in an abandoned, drafty Carthusian monastery up in the mountains at Valdemosa.
Monastery. And the Mediterranean sunshine they were hoping for, it turns into freezing torrential rain.
It's just awful.
Chopin's health completely craters. He writes this incredibly dark, almost farcical complaint about the local Spanish doctors. He says, "The first said I was dead, the second that I am dying, and the third that I'm going to die."
And to compound his misery, the custom-built Pleyel piano he ordered from Paris gets stuck in customs for months.
Oh, you have to be kidding.
No. So he is trapped in a freezing monastery, coughing up a lung, forced to compose on a locally made Juan Balsa piano that he complains is completely unplayable.
But this is the craziest part of the Majorca story. Despite the hostility, the freezing monastery, and the peril piano, this trip ends up being one of the most productive periods of his life.
It's astounding.
He finishes his legendary preludes, one for every single major and minor key, while shivering in that drafty cell.
Which tells you something profound about his internal drive. He was not a composer who waited around for a muse to grant him effortless inspiration.
It was work.
Hard work. George Sand actually left behind a vivid description of his creative process during the later summers they spent at her country estate in Nohant.
What did she say?
It was pure torment. She describes how he would lock himself in his room, weeping, pacing, and complaining. He would spend days making hundreds of minute, obsessive changes to a single bar of music, driving himself to the edge of sanity.
Just over one bar of music.
Yes. Only to eventually cross it all out and return to his very first original idea.
If you've ever stared at a draft of an email or a project for an hour, tweaking one word over and over until it loses all meaning, imagine that level of perfectionism stretched over an entire symphony.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
The physical toll of that obsessive mental process, combined with the permanent damage from the Majorca trip, really accelerated his decline. Eventually, the relationship with Sand ends in a remarkably bitter way.
Yeah, the breakup is rough.
She publishes a novel called Lucrezia Floriani, which is about a rich, vibrant actress and a sickly, demanding prince.
Oh.
Very. It is a thinly veiled, brutal caricature of them. It sours the relationship permanently, and they separate.
So by 1848, his health is failing rapidly, and then the 1848 revolution breaks out in Paris, completely cutting off his income from publishing and teaching.
He's broke and sick.
Desperate for money, he agrees to a tour of Great Britain funded by one of his wealthy Scottish pupils, Jane Stirling.
Calling it a tour almost feels wrong. It sounds like a grueling endurance test for a dying man. He's being dragged to all these grand British houses, playing for wealthy elites.
He even performs for Queen Victoria.
But by this point, he is so weakened by disease that he weighs less than 45 kilograms. That's under 99 pounds.
That's tragic.
His final public appearance on a concert platform is at London's Guildhall for a benefit for Polish refugees. And the tragic irony is that most of the attendees were more interested in the dancing and the buffet than in listening to this frail genius play the piano.
The tour drained whatever life he had left. He returns to Paris and dies in October 1849 at the age of 39.
39, so young.
The public reaction was massive, though. Over 3,000 people were turned away from his funeral at the Madeleine Church in Paris. And, exactly as he requested, Mozart's Requiem was sung.
But the story of his physical body takes a bizarre, almost gothic turn here. Chopin had an intense phobia of being buried alive.
Taphophobia.
Right, which, to be fair, wasn't completely irrational given the state of 19th century medical science. He specifically demanded that his heart be removed from his body to ensure he was actually dead before burial.
So his physician, Dr. Jean Crevellier, removes the heart, preserves it in a jar of alcohol, likely cognac, and hands it over to Chopin's sister, Ludwika.
And what does she do?
She hides the jar under her skirts and literally smuggles her brother's heart past border guards, all the way back to Poland.
That is incredible.
It is eventually sealed inside a stone pillar in the Holy Cross Church in Warsaw.
So the body remains in exile in Paris, but the heart finally returns home. And amazingly, the story of that heart has a modern postscript.
Oh, the 2014 study.
Yes. In 2014, a team of scientists were granted permission to conduct a visual examination of the preserved heart. They couldn't open the jar, but based on what they could see of the tissue, they concluded he likely died from a rare case of pericarditis, which was a complication of chronic tuberculosis.
So it finally gave a clinical answer to the romanticized consumption he suffered from his whole life.
It provides medical closure, yes. But looking at his life, cut so tragically short at 39, we have to ask how his legacy survived the initial misunderstandings of his own era.
Right, because during his life and immediately after, critics drastically misunderstood what he was doing.
How so?
In the 19th century, there's a huge tendency to feminize his music. Because he wrote delicate-sounding nocturnes, and because playing the piano was often dismissed as a polite female domestic pastime, male critics wrote off his work as sickly, androgynous, or just pretty background music meant for fainting ladies in drawing rooms.
Wow, they completely missed the point.
I did. It took 20th century scholars to come in, actually analyze the intricate architecture of the scores, and completely overthrow that myth.
What did they find?
They proved that his music wasn't just pretty. It possessed a fierce, rigorous structural genius. The polyphony, which is the way multiple independent melody lines interweave seamlessly, and his harmonic creativity were so advanced that he was essentially laying the groundwork for modern composers like Claude Debussy decades before they arrived.
And we also need to talk about what he physically did to the act of playing the piano. How did he actually change the mechanics of how human hands interact with the keyboard?
Well, before Chopin, standard classical piano technique often relied heavily on a stiff wrist, playing rigid block chords. The fingers were almost treated like a single, unified block striking the keys.
So very rigid.
Exactly. Chopin shattered that. He demanded total, absolute independence of the fingers. Imagine trying to write a letter with your right hand while simultaneously painting a detailed portrait with your left and having to do both flawlessly.
That sounds impossible.
That's the level of independence he required. He wrote pieces with massive double octaves, requiring the human hand to literally stretch further than it was used to. He essentially forced the human anatomy to adapt to his imagination. He didn't just write for the instrument, he demanded a new way of playing it.
He literally transformed the physical act of creating music. And knowing how obsessively he curated his art, weeping over single measures in George Sand's country house, agonizing over every note, it brings up a fascinating, provocative thought to end our dive today.
About his dying wish.
Yes. On his deathbed, Chopin made one final, very clear request regarding his legacy. He asked that all of his unpublished manuscripts be thrown into the fire and destroyed. He only wanted his absolute polished perfection to exist in the world.
But his mother, his sisters, and his musical executor, Julian Fontana, made a massive decision.
They ignored him.
They looked at his dying wish, and they completely ignored it. They saved the manuscripts, and dozens of masterpieces were eventually published posthumously.
Including the Fantasy Impromptu, which remains one of his most beloved and famous pieces today.
Thank goodness they didn't listen to him.
Right. It leaves you pondering a massive question about legacy, control, and art. How much of our cultural history, the art that moves us today, only exists because someone bravely decided to defy a dying genius's final wish?
It's a heavy thought.
It is. And on the flip side, it makes you wonder what other world-changing masterpieces we have lost forever simply because people did listen to the artist, tossing the pages into the fire.